body of Annette Allen has been retrieved from the Fraser River. Her death is traced back to a crack house located in Surrey, British Columbia, that police refer to as the House of Horrors. However, 2 searches have not turned up the slightest trace of Annette's DNA in the house. The investigators have completed an undercover operation targeting Joanna Larson. Armed with the allegations Larson has made about Francis Gauthier, the police launch a second undercover operation.
He was introverted, quiet, not very comfortable with himself.
Obviously he has some violent tendencies to do what he did, but you don't get that same sort of killer impression from Francis Gauthier that you get from Joanna Larson.
I think it was a little bit more difficult for him to talk about it, but in the end he seemed quite pleased with himself as well.
Gauthier eventually recounts his versions of the events.
He was sleeping on the couch when Joanna Larson brought Annette Allen to this house and began torturing her.
According to Gauthier, Annette Allen arrived at the house to buy drugs. As soon as she arrived, Larson forced her into the bathroom and started torturing, stabbing, and beating her. The torture continues for many hours. When she's had enough, she recruits Francis Gauthier to help her trunk Allen.
What was referred to on the street as being trunked, and that term referred to being beaten, having your head shaven, and being thrown in a trunk and driven around as, a form of punishment or a way of convincing you that you need to pay your bills.
Annette is unconscious and barely alive. Francis and Joanna wrap her in a plastic shower curtain. Then they lock her in a trunk of a car that is parked beside the house.
This residence also had normally multiple cars parked in the driveway, most of them without license plates or insurance, and it was kind of typical to have one good set of license plates and you just switch that to whichever car you chose to drive that day.
Initially, it was still daylight, so they waited for a while down in the Surrey area, the North Surrey area.
Larson and Gauthier drive around for several hours looking for a suitable place to dump Allen. They stop under the Alex Fraser Bridge. A heated argument erupts. While the 2 accomplices try to come to a decision, Allen manages to open the trunk. Larson and Gauthier realize what's happening, and they tie her up before heading back out. In their state of panic, they don't notice that they've been spotted. The man goes home and calls 911 to report what he witnessed. Eventually, Larson and Gauthier end up in New Westminster.
Right at the New Westminster Quay. It was about 100 yards up from where the body was found.
Allen begs them not to kill her. Gauthier strangles her. and Larson throw her body into the Fraser River. Gautier's confession to the undercover agents is the evidence the police need to lay charges against him. Gautier is arrested for the murder of Annette Allen. The arrests of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier brings Peter Cross closer to his goal. But he knows he still has his biggest challenge ahead of him, putting the offenders behind bars. What makes this case especially difficult is the fact that the witnesses and informants are drug addicts.
From an investigator's standpoint, it's horrendous. And then when you get into the court process, it becomes even more horrendous.
Totally unreliable. You might as well forget them coming in for an interview. If they do, it's a bit of a miracle. Unlikely to come to the court, even though they know they're supposed to. So you'd have to send the police off to pick them up and bring them in.
We have a lot of challenges with memory, recollection, how cognizant people were when the incidents occurred, fear, intimidation.
We were told from the very beginning, you'll never get this to court because the people will never come through it. Unless somebody's willing to step forward, you do not have a case. And it's a very difficult thing to prove.
Peter Cross and his team have an enormous task ahead of them. They begin preparing for the trials of Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier. Christopher McPherson is selected as Crown Prosecutor. His extensive experience as a defense lawyer dealing with drug addicts makes him the ideal person to prosecute this case.
Maybe that gave us a bit of an advantage in the sense of I've dealt with people like this for years and years and years in my office or interviewing them.
His experience also tells him he is facing an uphill battle in the case of Annette Allen.
We knew there were problems with it from the get-go. Sure, there was tape and there was rope and there was clothing, but none of that could be tied back to the house in any way. It was just basic stuff you could get anywhere. There was nothing that one could say was the weapons that were used in the assault. There were knives in the house, but there was nothing that you could say was used. The beating and stabbing took place in the bathroom, in the tub, and there was certainly evidence of cleaning up with bleach and things like that. I think, as I recall, I checked the trap of the tub, couldn't find anything. There was basically no physical evidence to tie Annette Allen to the house at all.
Even though Annette had been wrapped in plastic, he finds it very surprising that investigators were unable to find any forensic evidence in the car.
If we could have put Annette Allen in that car with a forensic evidence, that would have made the case a lot stronger.
Without any forensic evidence whatsoever, the prosecution's success will depend on two things: the undercover operations and the accounts of drug-addicted witnesses, both of which present significant problems. In Larson's case, it is by no means certain whether the information gathered during the undercover operation will be admissible in court. Some of the things she said contradict the evidence collected when the body was recovered.
Because they were so drug-addicted, just their sheer recollection or perception is just skewed. They don't remember things. So even if they're not trying to lie, it's like they don't have a complete grasp of what's going on around them anyways.
With no forensic evidence and unreliable witnesses, the odds are heavily stacked against the prosecution. Three people have been charged in relation to the death of Annette Allen. Her body was found in the Fraser River in New Westminster, British Columbia, in June of 2001. Joe Lagasse has been acquitted for lack of evidence connecting him to the murder. The prosecution is preparing cases against Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson. The suspects and the witnesses are heavily addicted to drugs, and this complicates the case considerably. Since these are the only witnesses available to the prosecution, one obvious solution presents itself. Investigators take the witnesses under their care and enroll them in a detox program so that they'll be able to participate fully in the trial.
It's up to the cop to increase the credibility of the drug addict turned witness, and one of the best ways to do this is to convince and assist the addict in abstaining for at least the duration of the court process. And hopefully they can provide the support services they need to remain sober.
It's not an easy task, but it's certainly worth a try.
They did an amazing job with 2 or 3 of the witnesses and making sure they were always there for them, taking them for coffee after, and keeping them on the straight and narrow, giving them a place to call if they started to feel like they were going to slip onto the other side.
I've got to give the police a lot of credit, because even though, it's a killing in the middle of the whole drug scene, they worked very, very hard and continued to work very hard right through the whole case. Because it was one of those cases that, okay, you've got enough evidence to charge a person, well, that's nice, but half your witnesses aren't going to come.
But one of the witnesses that the investigators support becomes a key witness in the trial.
She was a woman who came to the house to buy drugs.
And had to use the washroom, and when she went in, Annette was in the bathtub. And she saw her.
There is one issue that complicates the case even more: determining the cause of death.
One of the issues that came in court was the levels of toxicity in her body with the various drugs. One of the defense arguments was that the drugs killed her. So that became an issue in court because we basically had to show that she was a drug addict, and therefore her levels of this, it wasn't like the average person taking drugs for the first time.
And she still had a really high level of drugs in her system at the time of her death. So there are lots of questions like that. Were they injecting her with drugs? Is that not what actually happened? Was the time span much less than what they described? And you have to crack it up to they were both using drugs at the time too, and how accurate are those time frames?
One thing I find whenever there's witnesses who are heavily addicted to drugs, time is completely elastic. To try to figure out when something occurred approaches the impossible.
The prosecution has no tangible evidence, no cause of death, and unreliable witnesses. Finally, the trial date arrives, and the first person on the stand is Francis Gauthier. Following their preliminary hearings, which are several months apart, Francis Gauthier and Joanna Larson are charged with first-degree murder in the death of Annette Allen.
It wasn't a case that improved with time. Some of the witnesses became even less reliable. And I eventually agreed to take pleas to manslaughter on both of them.
The Crown was willing to take a plea with regard to manslaughter because predominantly when all of your witnesses are precariously perched on the edge of being able to testify and not being able to testify, if you go to trial and you have 10 so-so witnesses and defense starts taking them down and ruining their credibility, you can often end up with no good witnesses.
On November 5th, 2004, Francis Gauthier is sentenced to 18 years in prison for manslaughter. On June 2nd, 2005, Joanna Larson also receives 18 years. The court's decision represents an enormous victory for everyone involved in solving Annette Allen's murder.
We all had a relationship with Annette Allen in the sense that we thought that she was a legitimate victim and that this never should have happened, and it was tragic and horrific.
We were pretty pleased with the 18 years when it all is said and done, because that's probably at the very high end of manslaughter that you'll ever see.
I feel great every time I think about it. that it ended the way it did and that people went to jail and there was some justice for her death. For sure, my biggest lesson ever in being a police officer is that every one of those people have a story and a reason for where they are. And if you actually just sit down and listen, you're gonna maybe have a little bit more understanding and appreciation for the spot they're in.
We had a good investigative team. We did a good job on that file. It's one of those files that you're proud of at the end of the day. It's one of those files that you get asked about all the time. It's one of those files that people remember, that hit the media and the general public knows of it. And it's one of those cases where you actually see some good come of everything that you did.
The outcome of the trial has repercussions in the community.
We saw an impact on that little Wally community where nobody seemed to pay attention to them, and the neighbors constantly complained that the police wouldn't take them seriously.
The mayor, at the end of this, bulldozed the house and destroyed it. And I think it was kind of a symbolic gesture to say, we're taking care of these things and these crack shacks are going to be disposed of and dealt with accordingly.
To this day, the John Doe case is still being investigated. As years pass, hope fades that his death will ever be resolved. Joanna Larson and Francis Gauthier believed that they could outsmart the investigators in Annette Allen's case. But for them, water proved to be an unreliable accomplice.